This is game number 14 of the World Championship 1986 between Karpov and Kasparov. So far Kasparov has won 2 games, Karpov has won only 1 game. This is the new opening for this. First time they are opening is opening. This is LOPEZ C92. E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6. Karpov goes back to the LOPEZ. Bishop B5, A6, Bishop A4, knight F6. Kasparov castles. Bishop E7, rook E1, P5, Bishop B3, T6, C3, connecting queen and bishop. Karpov castles. H3, Bishop B7, D4, rook E8, knight B D2, Bishop F8, A4, H6, Bishop C2, E into D4. In the 9th game of their second match, Karpov tried a passive but solid knight. This time, with the score against him, he adopts a more active system of defense. C into D4, knight B4, Bishop B1, C5, D5, knight D7, rook A3, C4. This gives a foothold for the knight on D3, but at the same time it releases D4 for the occupation of an enemy knight. A into B5, A into B5, knight D4, rook into A3. Instead of rook into A3, better was, let us go back and see, queen B6. Instead of rook A3, queen B6. If knight F5 now, knight F5 now, G6, or knight 4th rank to F3. Let us go back to that. Knight C5 or knight F1. Let us go back and see. Knight F1, rook into A3 now, B into A3, knight D3, bishop into D3, queen into D4, bishop C2, queen into D1, rook into D1, knight C5. Okay, let us go back to the game. Last move played is rook into A3, B into A3, knight D3, bishop into D3, C into D3, bishop B2, queen A5. Instead of queen A5, G6, preventing the white knight from occupying F5 was better. in view of that quick momentum that white achieves for the king side attack. Knight f5, knight e5. The threat now is bishop into b7, b into g7 as shown in the figure, queen g4 with the mate threat on g7, bishop into e5. Instead of bishop into e5, this is a powerful move, and white plays with the great judgment of the position. So he gives a stronger bishop for the weaker knight. But very tempting would be, let us go back and see, instead of bishop into e5, tempting is f4, knight c4, knight into c4, pawn into c4, bishop into g7, bishop c8, or instead of bishop c8, bishop into g7, queen g4, queen into e1, queen into e1 check, king h2, queen a1 supporting the bishop, e5. Now mate cannot be avoided. Let us go back. Instead of bishop into g7, last move suggested was bishop c8. After bishop c8, bishop into f8, king into f8, and now there is no mate threat. Let us go back, and the last move played is bishop into e5, d into e5. Instead of d into e5, let us go back again and see. Rook e5, rook into e5, knight f3, rook into f5, e into f5, bishop into d5, rook e3, e3 is a excellent move. So let us go back. Last move played is d into e5, knight b3, queen b6. Queen b6 is a very good move. Instead of queen b6, if queen into a3, let us go back and see. Queen b6, which is a good move, queen into a3, queen into d3, queen b4, rook b1, and white is in trouble. Now the white knights are more powerful than the bishop after the last move played. That is why it is mentioned here as excellent move. Queen into d3, we have seen that. Queen into d3, rook a8, rook c1, g6, driving away the knight, knight e3, bishop into a3, rook a1, which is a good move, rook a4, knight g4, bishop f8. Here if instead of bishop f8, let us see that h5, knight into e5, bishop a6, rook into a3, b4, Knight c4. Let us go back. Last move played is bishop f8. Rook c1. Instead of rook c1, the immediate knight into f5 would allow black a lot of counter play with, let us go back and see. Instead of rook c1, which is a good move, if knight into e5 is immediately played, rook into a1 check, knight into a1, queen f6, queen g3, bishop g7, f4, g5. Let us go back. The last move played is rook c1, which was a good move. Queen d6. This queen d6 leads to a forced win for white, but Karpov had to work on this difficult position when he was already in time trouble. The bishop on f8 is overloaded with defense of the pawns on h6, e6 and the square c5, which the white knight threatens to invade. Knight c5. Instead of knight c5, if queen into b5, rook b4. Let us go back. The last move played is knight c5, rook c4. Instead of rook c4, rook d4, both queen g3 and queen into b5 easily wins for white. Now the pieces quickly engaged and white gets a simple one ending. Let us see how it is. Last move played is rook c4, rook into c4, b into c4, knight into b7, c into d3, knight into d6, bishop into d6, king f1. There was no need to be greedy with, let us go back and see. Knight into h6, king g7, knight g4, f5. Instead of knight into h6, white played king f1, king g7, f3, f5, knight f2, d2, king e2, bishop b4, knight d3, bishop c3, knight c5, and black resigns. Knight c5 was the sealed move. Black has no reply to knight b3 and king into d2. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your time. Please subscribe so that you can see the whole match of 24 games of this World Championship and also many more beautiful games of Bobby Fischer. Thanks for watching once again.